Hello everyone, I'm Robin and this is Savor at Home number 84. Now, obviously, as you can notice, I am doing this Savor at Home solo. So I hope to make up for Jerry not being here by tasting not just one whiskey, not just two whiskeys, but 3 different whiskeys produced at Brunt Stillhouse. Now, if you are not a resident of New York or New York City, you might not have heard of Brunt Stillhouse. They are located in Brooklyn, more specifically in Red Hook. And I didn't hear about them until I was in upstate New York for my sister's wedding back in the fall. While we were at the rehearsal dinner, I was able to try a few different expressions from Brunt and was really blown away. So when I was visiting New York a few weeks ago, I wanted to stop in and check out the distillery, and the distiller and owner of Brunt Stillhouse gave us a private tour. It was very cool. Thank you, Derek. Now, Brunt has been around for a while. They just celebrated their 10-year anniversary, which is a pretty big deal for a craft distillery. That means you've been around for a decent amount of time. And they are a farm distillery in New York. So again, they're located in Red Hook, which is in Brooklyn, a very industrial area in Brooklyn. And they source almost all of their ingredients from local New York farms. And in order to be a farm distillery in New York, at least 75% of your ingredients need to come from local New York farms. Farm distilleries are also limited to only being able to produce 75,000 gallons per year. Now, because Brunt Stillhouse has been around for a while, they were one of the first 7 distilleries to release an Empire Rye. This is a new style of American whiskey that's coming about, and it is distinctive to New York. Now, there aren't any legal definitions or legal regulations according to TTB labeling that regulate Empire Rye. However, the Empire Rye Whiskey Association sets these conditions for what classifies as an Empire Rye. The Empire Rye Whiskey Association was founded in 2015 by 6 New York State distillers that came together and wanted to create a New York-only whiskey product. They decided that in order for it to be called an Empire Rye, it must be made from at least 75% rye, all grown in New York State. It must be distilled to no more than 80% ABV, which is in line with whiskeys in the US. It must be aged for no less than 2 years in new charred oak casks, which again is in line with American whiskeys. The maximum barrel entry proof for the whiskey is where this gets a little bit more interesting. It is set at a maximum of 115 proof, or 57.5% ABV, if I did my math correctly. That is lower than what's typically seen in the US. In the US, it can be a maximum of 125 barrel entry proof. This is 62.5% ABV, so much higher than for Empire Rye. And that's because the Empire Rye Whiskey Association wanted to give a little nod to the pre-Prohibition era ryes that were being produced in the Northeast. And it was conventional to have a barrel entry proof of 100 proof, or 50% ABV. So a lower barrel entry proof is desired for these Empire Ryes. And finally, for an Empire Rye, it must be produced entirely. That means mashed, fermented, distilled, aged, and bottled all at one single New York State distillery. Okay, so the 3 different whiskeys that I'm going to be trying that are produced by Brunt Stillhouse are the Brunt Stillhouse American whiskey, their Empire Rye, and their smoked corn whiskey. Now, let's break down these whiskey labels. So their American whiskey is actually produced using 4 different grains. It's primarily made using barley and wheat, and rye and corn are kind of like the flavoring grains that add a little bit more something to the whiskey. In order to be whiskey in the US, it essentially just has to be a distilled spirit from fermented grains. And because this is labeled as just a whiskey, it means it doesn't fall under any of these other categories of whiskey, such as bourbon or rye, because the grains that are used in such proportions where they don't qualify as a bourbon, a rye, a wheat whiskey, etc. So this was the first whiskey that was produced by Van Brunt. And as we were talking to Derek, the distiller, he realized that the market wasn't ready for just a whiskey, right? Consumers, we know what a bourbon is. We know what a rye whiskey is now. Wheat whiskey, a little bit less so, right? Malt whiskey in the US, again, a little bit less so. These categories are starting to pop up now where we're becoming more and more familiar of different types of whiskeys. But usually when you think American whiskey, the first thing that comes to mind is bourbon, right? So as Derek was bringing around his American whiskeys to these liquor buyers, they were really enjoying it, but didn't know what to do with it, right? Where do you put it on the liquor shelves? And how do you make cocktails with it in a way that people will understand what it is? I think this is a really important part for us as consumers to understand, is these craft producers are trying to do really cool things, and we need to be educated in order to understand what it is that they're doing. Because we can't expect all of these craft producers to make bourbons and for us to enjoy them as much as we enjoy the bourbons that are produced by these massive distilleries in Kentucky. Or we can't expect them to be as affordable as, again, these big producers that are making tons and tons and tons of whiskey. These are small craft distilleries, and so everything that they're making, it has a sense of being handcrafted. After launching the American whiskey, Van Brunt also ended up producing a bourbon to appease the market and appease the consumers that just wanted to drink bourbon. I did try that when I was at the distillery. However, I didn't come home with a bottle of that. It is very delicious, lots of fun, and doesn't taste like the huge producers' bourbons, right? It has a lot more of those grain forward characteristics that you normally see in craft whiskeys. Anyways, that was a long rant. Ultimately, just to say that the American whiskey is made up of 4 different grains, and none of them are the majority. And this is why it doesn't fall under the bourbon, rye, wheat, or malt whiskey category. Nevertheless, because it has all these grains in it, we should expect that it is very grain forward, and we're going to get a variety of flavors that are coming from these ingredients. Okay, next I will be trying the Empire Rye. So I already went on a rant of what qualifies Empire Rye as Empire Rye. But as just a recap, this whiskey's mash bill is made up of 75% rye. More specifically, it is Danko rye, which is grown near the Finger Lakes region of New York. And the other 25% is malted barley. Something interesting is that Van Brunt doesn't just use regular old distiller's malt for their malted barley. They use a wide variety of types of malt. This is similar to what you see in beer, right? They're using different types of malting to create different flavor profiles, and that's essentially what Van Brunt is carrying over into their whiskeys when they use malted barley in the mash. This is aged for 2 years in char number 2 oak casks. The third thing I'm going to try is the smoked corn whiskey. Now, corn whiskey in the US is pretty unique. It is different from bourbon, right? Bourbon has to be a majority of corn in the mash, and it has to be aged in new charred oak casks, and this is not the case for corn whiskey. Corn whiskey has to be made from even more corn in the mash. It has to be a minimum of 80% corn. Now, what's really cool is that corn whiskey does not have to be aged. Or if it is aged, it has to be aged in used or uncharred oak casks. Now, the mash for this corn whiskey, the smoked corn whiskey, is 80% corn and 20% wheat. Before the whiskey is mashed, the corn is smoked, and it's smoked using American hardwoods. And I did ask Derek what hardwoods he used to smoke the corn, and he told me, and then I drank some whiskeys and I have since forgotten. Yeah, it's useless information now. But they smoke the corn in-house, then mash it, distill it, and then age it for 2 years in their own bourbon barrels. Before I taste these whiskeys, I just want to give a huge shout out to the Patreons. Thank you guys so much for helping to support the channel. I really appreciate you. And thank you for being a part of the neat community that we have on Patreon. Now, if you, the viewer, are not yet a Patreon, I would highly appreciate your support for the channel. You can head over to the link that I have in the description below if you want to be a supporter of the channel. Okay, let's taste these 3 whiskeys now. And we're going to start with the American whiskey. Remember, this was produced using 4 grains, right? We have barley and wheat as the main grains that are used in the mash, along with rye and corn. It's pretty light. I would call that a light honey color. And right off the bat, the grains are apparent. There's also some citrusiness. Now, I would say those grains are like whole wheat seeded bread. It's really nice. There's some nuttiness in there too. And the citrus is like orange and maybe some candied lemon. There's some toffee and some cinnamon sticks. There's some milk chocolate too. Maybe that's Tootsie Rolls? And there's some light notes of dried fruits in the background that are maybe raisins. So right away, the first flavor that I get is Fig Newtons. This is delicious. And then there's some rich chocolatiness. It's almost like malted chocolate. The grains have gone from whole wheat now to pumpernickel. And there's some sweet orange marmalade and vanilla notes. It's a little dry, and with that brings some more orange, some orange zest. All right, let's move on to the Empire Rye. Now remember, this is 75% rye. And that definitely has a little bit of a darker color to it. I would call it caramel and a little copper. This is funny. This is doing this spicy and savory, yet also sweet thing. And when we were tasting the whiskeys at the distillery, the first thing we tasted was the American whiskey. Now, the second thing we tasted was the bourbon. And I swear to you, I was getting notes of just straight up Italian sub. The whole thing. The bread had Italian seasoning on top. I was getting the mayo and then all the cured meats, as well as some banana peppers and some butter pickles. And yeah, it was so fun and so interesting. But I'm getting similar notes in here, so I'm thinking it's almost the order of how I'm tasting them, with starting with the American whiskey and then moving on to something else, because I'm getting some of those almost banana pepper and butter pickle notes. So let me work through that. Okay, there's definitely salted caramel and lots of dried fruits. I'm getting a little bit of citrus and some spices. Those spices are like fresh grated nutmeg with clove. And I'm also getting these chocolate covered almonds that are like dusted in cocoa powder. This has a great mouthfeel, and there's a lot of dark flavors going on. There's dark dried fruits like prunes, and then there's lots and lots of chocolatey notes. It's like cacao nibs. Ooh, that was some coffee. There's raisins, but it's almost like they're raisinettes because they're covered in chocolate. There's cocoa powder. No, that's Swiss Miss hot chocolate mix. And the marshmallows are toasted for sure. We could call this a s'mores. I'm getting notes of s'mores. And then in the finish, there's a little bit of like a bitter caramel thing. This is very decadent and delicious. Now, last but not least, let's try the smoked corn. Just as a recap, this is 80% corn that has been smoked using American hardwoods and 20% wheat in the mash. And of course, it's aged using ex-bourbon barrels produced at Van Brunt. So you can see the color is much lighter. This is definitely a light golden color. And on the nose right away, it's almost like sweet cigarettes. So there's like a candy thing and a cigarette thing. So it's like grandma's cigarette purse that has little candies in it, like little butterscotch candies in it. Okay, the smokiness is starting to turn into like a distant campfire. Maybe now I'm strolling by an auto body shop. Yeah, there's definitely some bushes with fresh blooming flowers. I'm snacking on some caramel corn. There's a little bit of pepper, and then there's a little bit of toasted spices, and I can't put my finger on what spices they are. Right away, there's tons of honey. So the smokiness that I was getting on the nose is much more subdued on the palate. Some hay notes for sure. So that toasted spice thing really comes through on the palate as well, and I'm still having a hard time pinpointing what spices exactly it is. But I think there's definitely some fennel in there, some fennel seed. There's a little bit of like white chocolate fudge and the inside of a Whopper, right? The malted milk part, I guess. And I'm getting tiny hints of citrus, and it's more of like this tropical citrus, maybe like key lime. All right, guys, so if you have stuck around for this entire video, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to give it a thumbs up if you did, and share it with friends, and leave me a comment below, all that stuff. Subscribe, that's another one. But overall, all three of these whiskeys were super delicious and really unique. Right? I'm not going to be able to find other whiskeys like this in the liquor store that are produced by these big brands that are behind me. So in summary, I really encourage you to go out and find those craft distilleries that are nearest to you and enjoy the cool spirits that they're making. The more that we support these local craft distilleries, the more that they're actually able to do these really fun expressions of whiskeys and other types of spirits. And that means we get more variety, which is even more fun for us. So yeah, highly recommend checking out Van Brunt Stillhouse if you haven't already. And if you're in New York City, go pay them a visit, and yeah, go on a tour and buy all their products because they are really delicious and really unique. Okay, Google, stop the timer. That's it. This is a long video. Sorry, guys.